What if I told you that in 1890, a man with no tractor, no irrigation system, and no bank loan was earning the equivalent of a six-figure income from a plot of land smaller than most American backyards? Not from hundreds of acres. Not from a commercial operation. From roughly 1.5 acres of hand-tended garden beds on the outskirts of Paris. And what if I told you that the system he used was documented, tested, and proven, and then deliberately forgotten? Not because it failed, not because something better came along, but because it made farmers too independent to need what the agricultural industry was selling. Today, we're going to rebuild that system from the ground up. Paris in the 1800s had a problem. Millions of people needed fresh vegetables every single day, and there were no refrigerated trucks, no cold storage, no imported produce from distant states. The men and women who solved this problem were called the maraîchers, the Paris market gardeners. They worked small plots on the city's outskirts, and they developed a 4-part system so productive that modern researchers studying their records couldn't believe what they were seeing. Yields per square foot that exceeded anything industrial equipment would achieve a century later. Year-round production in a climate that should have made it impossible. And incomes that modern small farmers would envy today. By the time this is over, you'll understand exactly how they did it, and how you can replicate it starting this season on a 1/4 acre. The first and most foundational principle the Paris market gardeners built their entire system on was treating soil not as a background condition, but as the primary product. They understood something that industrial agriculture has spent a century trying to make people forget, that the wealth is in the ground, not the seeds. They had access to the horse manure of Paris itself, tens of thousands of horses producing waste that had to go somewhere. The maraîchers paid to receive it, composted it into rich biological material, and worked it into their beds in quantities that seem almost absurd by modern standards. The result was soil so alive it generated its own heat in winter. This wasn't gardening, this was soil engineering. And everything else in the system, the yields, the speed, the flavor, the financial returns, flowed directly from the depth and quality of that biological foundation. Today you don't need Parisian horse stables. You need compost, built from kitchen scraps, yard waste, and any local organic material you can source. The principle is identical. Build the soil first, and the soil generates the income. The second principle was narrow beds, and this single structural decision changed everything about how the system functioned. Conventional agriculture spaces its rows around one constraint, the width of a horse or a tractor. The Paris market gardeners designed around a completely different constraint, the reach of a human arm. Their beds were never wider than 4 feet, always workable from both sides without ever stepping inside. This sounds simple. The implications are enormous. Soil that is never walked on never compacts. Roots move through it freely. Water moves through it perfectly. The biological structure, the air pockets, the fungal networks, the earthworm channels, stays intact year after year. Every time a gardener steps into a conventional bed and compresses the soil, they undo weeks of biological work without realizing it. The narrow bed eliminates that loss entirely. It is not a compromise or a convenience. It is the structural foundation that makes every other part of the system possible, because loose, uncompacted soil at the right depth responds to everything else you do to it in ways that compacted soil simply cannot. The third principle was double digging, and this is where most modern gardeners stop reading because it sounds like too much work. Here is what they're giving up by stopping. A tiller works to 6 inches of depth. A standard spade reaches 12. The Paris market gardeners worked their soil to 24 inches, by hand, using a technique called double digging. You remove the top 12 inches, loosen the subsoil beneath it, add compost to the lower layer, and return the topsoil enriched with more compost. The bed rises above the surrounding pathways. It becomes a sponge. A carrot that takes 90 days in ordinary ground reaches maturity in 60. A lettuce head that would be modest in a typical bed grows dense and market-ready faster than any seed packet predicts. You do this once per bed. After that, you maintain rather than repeat, adding compost to the surface each season and letting biology carry it downward. The labor investment is front-loaded and real. So is the return. Beds prepared this way produce at a level that no surface-tilled garden will ever match, and they continue improving every year as the biology deepens. The fourth principle was hexagonal planting, spacing crops not in straight parallel rows with empty space between them, but in an offset pattern where each plant sits in the gap between the 2 plants ahead of it. When mature, the leaves of neighboring plants just barely touch. That leaf canopy does three things simultaneously that row gardening cannot replicate. It shades the soil, which suppresses weeds without chemicals. It retains moisture, reducing the need for irrigation. And it maximizes the number of productive plants per square foot by 30 to 50% compared to conventional spacing. Every additional plant in that bed is additional income from the same soil, the same water, the same labor. The Paris market gardeners weren't planting more densely because they enjoyed extra work. They were planting more densely because idle ground between plants was a financial liability. Every inch of bed that grew nothing was money the land was failing to produce. Hexagonal planting was the answer to that problem, and it remains one of the most immediately applicable and highest return changes any gardener can make. The fifth principle was succession planting, and this is where most gardeners leave the most money on the table. The typical home garden plants in spring, harvests in summer, and lets beds sit empty through fall. That empty bed is not neutral. It represents land you own, soil you've built, location you've secured, producing nothing. The Paris market gardeners had a rule that governed every decision they made. A bed is never empty. The moment one crop comes out, another goes in, not eventually that day. They achieved this through meticulous planning, staggering plantings so that as radishes finished at day 30, a flat of lettuce transplants was already 4 weeks old and waiting. As lettuce finished, carrots were ready to sow. A single 100-square-foot bed managed with tight succession might produce 5 or 6 distinct crops per year. The same bed managed the typical way produces 1 or 2. If that bed generates $200 with 1 crop, it generates $800 with 4. The land cost is identical. The soil cost is identical. Only the planning changes. Succession planting is not a technique. It is a mindset shift about what land is for. The sixth principle was season extension, and it is what transformed the Paris market gardeners from seasonal producers into year-round income generators. Paris winters are cold, gray, and long. Growing fresh lettuce in February should have been impossible. The maraîcher made it possible using 2 tools: glass cloches placed over individual plants like small greenhouse domes, and the heat generated by composting manure packed beneath and around their beds. Fresh horse manure composts at 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit at its core. Combined with glass trapping solar gain above, this created microclimates where crops thrived while the surrounding city froze. The financial logic was straightforward. The gardener who could offer fresh lettuce in March while everyone else waited until May wasn't just selling lettuce. They were selling scarcity. Early crops command the highest prices of the season, before supply catches up with demand. Today, cold frames built from salvaged windows and row cover fabric costing a few dollars per bed accomplish the same thing. A 6-month growing season becomes a 10-month growing season. That difference multiplied across 20 beds is the difference between a productive garden and a serious income source. The 7th principle was direct-to-market selling, and it is the multiplier that makes everything else financially meaningful. Industrial agriculture earns pennies per pound on commodity crops because everyone is growing the same thing at the same time for the same buyers. A pound of supermarket lettuce earns the farmer perhaps 15 cents after costs. A head of beautiful, same-day harvested variety-specific lettuce sold directly at a farmer's market commands $2 to $4. Same crop, same soil. Completely different financial reality. The Paris market gardeners did not sell to wholesalers. They maintained relationships with specific Parisian households and restaurants willing to pay for what wholesale couldn't provide: freshness, variety, reliability, and quality with a face behind it. A CSA model is the modern equivalent: 20 to 30 families paying at the start of the season before you've grown a single leaf. Income arrives before expenses are due. 20 CSA members at $30 a week for 22 weeks is $13,000 from a quarter acre. That number is not theoretical. It is documented reality from growers operating right now in every region of this country. The 8th and final principle was treating the garden as a business, not a hobby. The Paris market gardeners kept meticulous records. They tracked which beds produced what, which successions worked seamlessly, which crops commanded the best prices at which times of year. They were not romantics tending the earth for spiritual satisfaction. They were small business operators who happened to work in soil. The difference between a productive market garden and a hobby that never generates real income is not effort. Both gardeners work. The difference is planning density. How many decisions are made in advance? How much of the season's income is committed before the first seed goes into the ground? A market gardener doesn't ask what to plant this spring. They ask what each bed will be producing every week from March through November, what needs to be started before the previous crop is harvested, and which crops are commanding the best prices right now in their local market. That orientation, systematic, forward-looking, financially aware, is what converts a piece of ground into a compounding asset. Here is what this means for you, right now, with whatever ground you have available. The French intensive system was not replaced because it failed. It was set aside because it was incompatible with a food system designed to make farmers dependent on input companies, on shipping networks, on retail chains that profit on both the selling end and the buying end. Independent farmers don't need what industrial agriculture is selling, and that is precisely why this knowledge was allowed to fade. But it was never disproven. It was never superseded by something that worked better for the farmer. It was simply inconvenient for everyone except the person growing the food. The ground beneath your feet is not waiting for better technology or a larger plot or more favorable conditions. It is waiting for the same thing it has always responded to: deep preparation, biological richness, intelligent planning, and consistent attention. Year 1, you are building. Year 2, you are learning. Year 3, you are producing seriously. And 5 years from now, you will have a quarter acre that has become, through patient stewardship, one of the most productive pieces of ground in your entire region, with no supply chain that can fail you, no commodity price that can ruin you, and no corporation standing between you and the soil that feeds you. The system works. It has always worked. The only thing left is to start digging.